Choose carefully, Princess, the High Counselor said, his voice echoing through the vast chamber of glass and silver, because the future of two civilizations will remember the man you point to. The arena of Orion Gate shimmered beneath a ceiling of transparent alloy where the stars burned cold and distant, thousands of spectators watching from floating balconies while dozens of alien envoys observed in perfect, silent rows. At the center of the chamber stood 20 human men arranged in a long line across the polished floor, each of them carefully selected by diplomats, military advisors, and cultural analysts who believed they understood what an alien princess might want. Some wore decorated uniforms with rows of medals reflecting the pale light. Others wore tailored suits worth more than a small house in Ohio. One was a famous test pilot who had flown experimental ships beyond the orbit of Jupiter. Another was a brilliant scientist whose research stations orbited Mars. Every one of them stood straight, confident, aware that billions across the galaxy were watching this moment unfold. At the far end of the chamber, the great doors opened without a sound and Princess Sarilith Vera stepped into the light. Her skin carried the soft emerald hue of her people, smooth as polished jade, and her silver hair drifted slightly in the low gravity like threads of moonlight. Her eyes, luminous and thoughtful, scanned the line of human candidates while the council elders watched from their elevated thrones carved from black crystal. According to ancient treaty law, the heir of her dynasty had to choose a human mate to secure the new alliance between Earth and the Veran Dominion. The ritual was older than the star maps themselves. A choice meant trust. A choice meant peace. But the council had expected something predictable. A hero. A leader. A symbol of strength. Sarilith began walking slowly down the line, her footsteps soft against the reflective floor. The first man saluted with crisp military precision. The second offered a confident smile practiced for cameras. The third bowed politely. Every one of them watched her closely, hoping to read the direction of her gaze. Only one person in the entire chamber was not watching the princess at all. Near the maintenance access door, slightly outside the perfect alignment of candidates, stood a tall man in a simple gray station uniform with a faded name patch. That read Lucas Hale. A janitor. He had been placed there almost by accident when station security realized they were one candidate short of the required 20. Lucas held a cleaning cloth in one hand and quietly tightened a loose maintenance latch on the wall beside him, the small metal hinge clicking softly into place. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look hopeful. In fact, he barely seemed aware that the most powerful royal figure in the Veran Dominion was walking toward him while billions watched the broadcast across the stars. Sarilith slowed as she approached the final 3 candidates, her expression calm, thoughtful, almost curious. She passed the decorated pilot. She passed the wealthy diplomat. Then she stopped walking. The chamber grew so quiet that the hum of the station's oxygen filters could be heard across the vast room. Slowly, the princess turned her gaze toward the one human who wasn't even trying to impress her. Lucas finished tightening the latch, wiped a streak of machine grease from his fingers, and only then noticed that the entire arena had gone silent. He looked up. For a moment, the princess studied him as if he were the only person in the room. Then she lifted her hand and pointed. "That one," she said calmly. The council chamber erupted with shocked whispers, but Sarilith Vera never looked away from the quiet man who hadn't even realized he was part of the test. Lucas Hale blinked once as if he had misheard something and the enormous chamber of Orion Gate slowly came back into focus around him, the floating balconies packed with silent observers, the long line of carefully selected human candidates now staring in disbelief while the council elders leaned forward from their black crystal thrones. For several seconds Lucas did not move. He simply looked behind himself, checking whether there might be another person standing there. There was not. The maintenance corridor door rested quietly at his back and the small latch he had just tightened clicked softly as the station adjusted to the pressure balance of the orbiting platform. The princess was still pointing directly at him. Lucas cleared his throat and spoke in a calm voice that carried farther than he expected in the still air. "I think you may have the wrong guy." A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the chamber while several counselors exchanged alarmed. Looks. The High Counselor rose slowly, his tall frame wrapped in ceremonial robes threaded with silver symbols that glowed faintly under the ceiling lights. Princess Seralith Vera, he said carefully, the ritual requires that you choose among the approved candidates presented before you. His gaze shifted toward Lucas and paused at the gray uniform, the cleaning cloth, the faint line of machine grease across the human's knuckles. This individual is not one of the diplomatic nominees. Lucas lifted the cloth slightly as if to demonstrate the point. I clean air filters on deck 7, he said. I am pretty sure I am not supposed to be standing in the middle of a royal ceremony. Several human representatives shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. The princess did not react to the tension spreading through the arena. Instead she stepped forward one pace, the soft light of the chamber reflecting along the emerald tone of her skin and the quiet silver strands of her hair. Her eyes remained fixed on Lucas with calm concentration, as though she were studying something most others could not see. You are Lucas Hale, she said. It was not a question. Lucas looked mildly surprised that she knew his name. Yes ma'am, he answered after a moment. That is correct. One of the council advisors leaned toward the High Counselor and whispered urgently while several security drones hovered higher above the chamber floor, their scanning lights flickering as they attempted to understand the unfolding situation. The entire ceremony had been planned for months. The candidates had been analyzed by psychologists, strategists, and political advisors. None of them had prepared for the princess to choose the one human who had not even known he was part of the process. The High Counselor folded his hands slowly. Princess, he said, you may reconsider your selection before the ritual is finalized. The words hung in the quiet air like a fragile piece of glass. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Look, he said gently, glancing toward the long row of decorated candidates, you have a lot of impressive people here. Pilots. Commanders. Probably someone who actually understands diplomacy. I just make sure the trash compactor on deck 3 does not jam. A few scattered chuckles rose from the balconies before quickly fading again into silence. Seralith Vera studied him for another long moment. Then she lowered her hand and walked directly across the polished floor until she stood only a few feet away from the quiet maintenance worker. The entire arena leaned forward. Lucas shifted his weight slightly, unsure where to look as the princess of an interstellar empire stopped in front of him and spoke in a voice that was calm enough to quiet the entire chamber. Lucas Hale, she said, why are you the only human here who was not trying to be chosen? Lucas Hale shifted his weight slightly, still holding the small cleaning cloth in one hand as the enormous council chamber waited for his answer. The lights above reflected across the polished floor, stretching his shadow toward the princess who stood calmly a few feet away from him. For a long moment he simply looked around the arena, at the decorated pilots, the confident diplomats, the scientists whose names appeared regularly in global news reports. Then he looked back at Princess Seralith Vera and gave a small shrug. Because I did not know I was supposed to be trying, he said plainly. A quiet wave of murmurs spread across the floating balconies again, but Lucas did not seem bothered by the attention. His voice remained steady, the same calm tone a maintenance worker might use while explaining a loose panel or a broken ventilation fan. I was fixing a hinge, he added, nodding toward the small metal latch on the wall behind him. Security told me to stand here for a minute while they finished organizing the line. I figured it would take about 30 seconds. Several council members exchanged confused looks. The High Counselor narrowed his eyes slightly, studying the human with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. You are aware that the princess must select a human partner to represent the alliance between our civilizations, the counselor said. Lucas nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I heard that part once the ceremony started. The counselor gestured toward the line of distinguished candidates. And you understand that the individuals presented here were chosen for their accomplishments, leadership, and cultural influence. Lucas glanced down the row again. The pilot stood tall with perfect posture. The scientist adjusted his glasses nervously. The diplomat attempted a polite smile that had clearly been rehearsed many times before. Lucas exhaled softly. "They all look qualified," he said. "That is kind of my point." The chamber quieted again as Princess Seralith watched him carefully. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment at the confusion spreading through the council hall. Instead there was a faint spark of interest, as if she had been waiting for exactly this kind of answer. "Lucas Hale," she said, her voice calm but steady, "if you were asked to stand here as a candidate, what would you do differently from the others?" Lucas thought about the question for a moment. He rubbed a small streak of grease from his palm using the cloth and glanced briefly toward the ceiling where distant stars shimmered through the transparent alloy dome. "Honestly," he said, "I would probably be doing the same thing I do every day on this station." The High Counselor leaned forward slightly. "Which is?" Lucas looked back at him with an expression that was almost apologetic. "Keeping things running," he replied. "Air filters, water pumps, temperature controls. Most people do not notice those systems unless they stop working. My job is making sure they do not stop." The quiet simplicity of the answer drifted across the chamber like a soft echo. Several observers shifted in their seats. A few of the other candidates slowly lowered their shoulders as if realizing the moment had already passed them by. Princess Seralith stepped one pace closer, studying the human who still looked slightly confused about why the entire galaxy seemed to be staring at him. "And if someone important depended on those systems working," she asked gently, "what would you do?" Lucas gave a small smile that was calm and unpretentious. "Then I would fix the problem," he said. "That is usually how maintenance works." For a second the enormous chamber fell completely silent again. The High Counselor folded his hands and glanced toward the other elders, clearly uncertain how the ceremony had drifted into such an unexpected direction. But Princess Seralith Vera did not appear uncertain at all. She simply nodded once, as though Lucas Hale had just confirmed something she had already suspected the moment she first saw him standing quietly beside the maintenance door. The silence in the council chamber lingered several seconds after Lucas Hale finished speaking, the quiet hum of the orbital station's life support systems echoing faintly through the enormous hall as if the building itself had decided to listen. Princess Seralith Vera remained standing directly in front of him, her luminous eyes steady, thoughtful, almost patient, while the High Counselor slowly lowered himself back into his seat of black crystal. Around the arena the observers whispered among themselves, diplomats from half a dozen star systems leaning closer together while analysts typed rapid notes into floating tablets. None of this appeared to interest Lucas very much. He glanced briefly at the ceiling dome where distant stars shimmered across the darkness and then back toward the maintenance corridor door behind him as though he might quietly return to work once the ceremony concluded. The High Counselor finally raised one hand and the chamber settled into silence again. "Princess Seralith," he said carefully, "the ritual selection is binding once declared. However, the Council must confirm that your decision serves the stability of the interstellar alliance." His voice carried the careful tone of someone balancing tradition against political reality. "The individual you have chosen does not possess diplomatic training, military honors, or planetary influence." Lucas lifted one eyebrow slightly at that description but remained silent. The counselor continued, "Our advisors recommended candidates who represent the strength and leadership of humanity." The princess turned slowly, allowing her gaze to sweep across the long line of distinguished humans who had arrived expecting their moment of glory. Some stood stiff with frustration. Others looked simply confused. Then she looked back at Lucas Hale. "Strength," she said softly, almost as if she were testing the word itself. She stepped past him and walked toward the maintenance panel on the wall where he had tightened the loose hinge earlier. With gentle curiosity she touched the metal latch and felt the firmness of the repair. "This door would have eventually jammed," she observed quietly. Lucas nodded once. "Probably within a week," he said. "It is a small hinge but it carries the weight of the panel when the station rotates." The princess turned slightly toward the council seats. "And if that door jammed?" she asked. Lucas answered without hesitation. Maintenance would need to shut down the corridor for repairs. That means rerouting air circulation and temperature control for 2 decks. It would not be catastrophic, but it would inconvenience about 300 people for several hours. The council chamber fell silent again as the scale of his explanation settled into the room. It was not dramatic. It was not heroic. It was simply practical. Saralith folded her hands lightly. So this small hinge prevents disruption for hundreds of lives, she said. Lucas shrugged again. Most systems work that way, he replied. Little things hold big things together. The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. A few council members shifted slightly in their seats. The High Counselor studied the quiet human more carefully now, as though reconsidering the assumptions he had made earlier. Princess Saralith stepped closer to Lucas again and spoke in a calm voice that carried clearly through the silent hall. My people rule star systems that stretch across thousands of light years, she said. We build enormous ships, command powerful fleets, and negotiate treaties between worlds. Her eyes moved briefly across the gathered observers. Yet our histories also record that civilizations often collapse not because of great wars but because the small things were ignored. Lucas looked mildly surprised that his simple maintenance explanation had turned into a philosophical discussion, but he did not interrupt. Saralith returned her gaze to him. You repair the small things that others overlook, she said. You do it quietly. Without recognition. Lucas rubbed the cloth between his fingers and gave a modest half-smile. That is kind of the job description. The princess nodded once, as if confirming a private conclusion that had been forming since the beginning of the ceremony. Then she turned back toward the council and spoke with quiet certainty. Which is precisely why I chose him. The council chamber remained unusually quiet after Princess Saralith Vera spoke those words, the kind of silence that did not come from confusion but from careful thinking. Several elders exchanged slow glances with one another while distant observers leaned closer to the glowing rails of the floating balconies. Lucas Hale stood exactly where he had been a moment before, still holding the small cleaning cloth in his hand as if the entire ceremony might end and send him back to the maintenance corridors at any second. The High Counselor folded his hands together and studied the princess with a thoughtful expression. Your reasoning is unconventional, he said slowly. The alliance between our civilizations carries enormous weight. It requires stability, leadership, and public confidence. He gestured gently toward the row of candidates who had been selected with such careful planning. These individuals were chosen because they represent humanity at its highest level. Lucas glanced again toward the line of decorated candidates and nodded politely. They seem like good choices, he said quietly. Honestly, I am still trying to understand how I ended up here. A faint ripple of restrained laughter moved across the balconies before fading again into silence. Princess Saralith did not appear amused or embarrassed. She simply regarded Lucas with the same calm attention she had shown since the beginning of the ceremony. You ended up here because someone asked you to stand in a line, she said. Lucas shrugged lightly. That sounds about right. The princess stepped slowly across the polished floor until she stood beside the long row of human candidates, examining each face for a moment as if she were reading a page from a long history. The decorated pilot stood tall with disciplined confidence. The scientist adjusted his posture carefully. The diplomat offered another courteous smile. Then she turned and walked back toward Lucas. All of these men have impressive achievements, she said. Their accomplishments are known across worlds. Lucas nodded once. That tends to happen when people do big things. The princess tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Yet you said something earlier that interests me, she continued. You said most systems only work because someone maintains the small details. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck, clearly not expecting philosophical analysis of his daily routine. Yes, ma'am, he replied. If nobody checks the small components, eventually something important stops working. Seralith lifted her gaze toward the vast transparent ceiling of the chamber where distant stars glimmered like scattered silver dust. Empires are also systems, she said softly. So are alliances. The council elders listened closely now. The High Counselor did not interrupt. The princess continued in a calm voice that carried easily across the hall. My people have studied humanity for decades. Your history shows remarkable ambition, creativity, and strength. But it also shows something else. She looked back at Lucas. Individuals who quietly keep the structure of society functioning while others seek recognition. Lucas shifted his weight again, clearly uncomfortable being described as a philosophical example. I mostly just fix broken panels, he said. That is about as exciting as my day usually gets. For the first time a faint smile touched the corner of Seralith's expression. It was not dramatic, just a small acknowledgement of the quiet honesty standing in front of her. Exactly, she said. You do your work without the expectation of applause. Around the chamber the council members exchanged thoughtful looks. What had begun as confusion was slowly transforming into curiosity. The High Counselor finally spoke again. Princess Seralith, he said carefully, are you suggesting that this human represents a quality you believe essential for the alliance? Seralith Vera nodded once with quiet certainty. Yes, she answered. Because the strongest civilizations are not built only by those who seek power. She turned slightly toward Lucas Hale again, her luminous eyes steady and calm. They are sustained by those who quietly make sure everything continues to work. Lucas looked down at the cleaning cloth in his hand, then back at the princess, still unsure why the entire galaxy seemed to be discussing his maintenance schedule as if it were a matter of interstellar philosophy. The quiet discussion spreading through the council chamber did not fade quickly. Instead it moved slowly across the balconies like a shifting tide as diplomats, scholars, and observers reconsidered what they had just heard. Lucas Hale remained standing near the maintenance corridor door, now slightly unsure whether he should still be holding the cleaning cloth or hide it somewhere behind his back. He glanced toward the long line of decorated candidates again and then toward the princess, as if trying to determine whether someone might politely correct the entire situation and send him back to Deck 7. The High Counselor rested his hands on the armrests of his dark crystal seat and studied Lucas with a much more patient expression than before. Human Lucas Hale, he said calmly, you appear remarkably comfortable speaking in front of an interstellar council. Lucas shook his head immediately. Sir, I would not call this comfortable. A few quiet chuckles moved across the balconies again. Lucas continued in the same steady tone. I just answer questions the way I would answer anyone who asks how something works. The counselor leaned slightly forward. Then allow me to ask another. Lucas nodded politely. Yes, sir. The High Counselor gestured toward the enormous chamber surrounding them, the star-filled ceiling above, and the countless observers watching the ceremony. You now understand that the princess has selected you as her partner in a treaty that could influence the future of two civilizations. Lucas let out a slow breath and looked around the arena once more. The scale of the situation was beginning to settle in. Yes, sir, he said quietly. I believe I understand that part now. The counselor's voice remained measured. Most individuals placed in your position would attempt to prove themselves worthy of such responsibility. Lucas tilted his head slightly. How exactly would someone prove that? The question was simple and sincere, not sarcastic. It caused several council members to exchange thoughtful looks again. The High Counselor considered his response carefully. They might speak about ambition, leadership, or their vision for the future. Lucas nodded slowly as if acknowledging a reasonable idea. Then he folded the cloth in his hands and answered with calm honesty. Sir, I have never led a fleet or negotiated a treaty. My vision for the future mostly involves making sure the air recyclers on this station do not break down during a heat cycle. A faint smile appeared on the face of one of the alien scholars observing from the balcony above. Princess Seralith remained very still, watching Lucas with the same quiet attention. The High Counselor spoke again after a moment. And if the responsibility placed before you becomes greater than repairing station equipment? Lucas looked toward the princess for a brief second before answering. Then I would probably ask a lot of questions and try to learn how things work. The simplicity of the statement drifted through the chamber like a clear note. No grand promise. No attempt to impress anyone. Just the straightforward approach of someone who solved problems step by step. Princess Seralith finally stepped forward again until she stood beside Lucas rather than across from him. From the balconies the observers could now see them side by side beneath the wide dome of stars. She turned slightly toward the council elders. My people often believe wisdom comes from those who seek authority, she said calmly. Human history suggests something different. Lucas glanced sideways at her, still uncertain why he had become an example in an interstellar philosophy debate. The princess continued, her voice steady and thoughtful. Humans who quietly maintain their communities often understand systems better than those who only command them. The High Counselor slowly leaned back into his seat, studying both figures at the center of the chamber. For the first time since the ceremony began, there was no trace of objection in his expression. Only curiosity remained. Lucas Hale shifted his weight again and gave a modest half-smile. For the record, he said gently, I still have a ventilation unit on Deck 7 that probably needs checking. The enormous chamber remained silent for a second before a ripple of warm laughter moved across the balconies, and even the High Counselor allowed the smallest hint of amusement to appear. The soft laughter that moved through the balconies slowly faded, leaving behind a calmer atmosphere inside the enormous chamber of Orion Gate. For the first time since the ceremony had begun, the tension that once filled the room seemed to loosen slightly, as if the entire gathering had realized that the quiet maintenance worker standing beneath the dome of stars was not trying to win anything at all. Lucas Hale shifted the folded cloth in his hands and looked toward the princess beside him with a polite uncertainty that had not changed since the beginning of the event. Just to be clear, he said quietly, am I still allowed to go check that ventilation unit later? A few of the alien scholars smiled again, and even the High Counselor allowed a faint breath of amusement to pass before lifting one hand for silence. Human Lucas Hale, the counselor said calmly, the matter before us may determine the stability of relations between two civilizations. Your ventilation schedule may need to wait a little longer. Lucas nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. That seems reasonable. The High Counselor then turned his attention toward Princess Seralith Vera. Princess, he continued, your reasoning has been heard. However, the Council must ensure that your choice is not made lightly. The individual you have selected has shown honesty and practical thinking, but alliances of this magnitude require trust under uncertain conditions. The princess listened quietly, her posture calm and balanced beneath the soft glow of the chamber lights. What would the Council ask of him? She replied. The elder counselor paused for a moment as if considering how to frame the question. Nothing dramatic, he said slowly. Simply an understanding of responsibility. His gaze returned to Lucas. Human Hale, imagine that this alliance places millions of lives in a shared system of cooperation. Different cultures, different expectations, different technologies. Problems will arise. Misunderstandings will occur. How would you approach a system that complex? Lucas did not answer immediately. He looked upward at the transparent dome where the distant stars shimmered quietly above the station. For a moment the enormous council chamber felt almost like one of the silent engineering bays he worked in every day. Then he spoke. The same way I approach any system, he said. The High Counselor tilted his head slightly. Explain. Lucas gestured gently toward the vast structure around them. Everything here works because thousands of small systems are connected. Air recycling, water circulation, temperature balance, power distribution. If one part fails, the others feel it. So the first thing you do is understand how the pieces connect. The council members listened carefully now. Lucas continued in the same calm tone he might use while explaining a repair to a junior technician. You listen to the people who know their part of the system best. Engineers know engines. Farmers know food supply. Teachers know how communities grow. If you ignore the people who actually keep things running, you will never understand the whole system. The High Counselor leaned back slowly as the answer settled across the chamber. There had been no dramatic speech, no grand promises about power or glory. Just a quiet explanation of how things functioned. Princess Seralith watched Lucas closely during his answer, her luminous eyes thoughtful. And if conflict appears between those parts of the system, she asked gently. Lucas shrugged slightly, the same practical gesture he had used all evening. Then you slow down and fix the problem before it spreads, he replied. Most breakdowns start small. If people listen early enough, the repair is usually simple. The enormous chamber remained silent again. Several council members exchanged long thoughtful glances. The High Counselor rested his hands together and studied the human maintenance worker standing beneath the ceiling of stars. Then he spoke in a voice that carried through the hall with quiet clarity. Princess Seralith, he said, it appears the individual you selected may understand systems more deeply than we first assumed. Lucas looked mildly surprised again and rubbed the back of his neck. Sir, he said gently, I just fix things that stop working. Beside him, the princess allowed the smallest smile to return as she answered the council with calm certainty. That, she said, is exactly why I trust him. The quiet certainty in Princess Seralith Vera's voice settled across the council chamber like a calm wave, and for a moment no one spoke. The enormous hall beneath. The star-filled dome remained still while hundreds of observers waited for the council elders to respond. Lucas Hale stood beside the princess with the same modest posture he had carried since the beginning of the ceremony, his gray maintenance uniform slightly wrinkled and a faint line of grease still visible along one knuckle. He glanced once toward the maintenance corridor door again, almost out of habit, then returned his attention to the High Counselor. The elder leaned forward slowly, resting both hands on the dark crystal arms of his seat as if weighing the final balance of tradition and logic. Princess Seralith, he said carefully, the council must acknowledge that your reasoning has merit. However, the treaty ritual was designed to reveal character under observation. What we have seen today is unusual. Lucas quietly lifted one eyebrow at that description but remained silent. The counselor continued, most candidates presented themselves with ambition. This human presented himself with honesty. Several council members nodded faintly. The High Counselor's gaze shifted back to Lucas. Human Hale, do you understand that your words today have influenced the judgment of this council? Lucas exhaled slowly and gave a small, uncertain smile. Sir, I mostly answered questions about how systems work. I did not realize it would influence anything. A faint ripple of quiet amusement moved across the balconies again. The counselor allowed the moment to pass before speaking once more. Sometimes the simplest explanations reveal the most useful truths. He then turned his attention back toward the princess standing beside the maintenance worker. Princess Seralith Vera, if the council approves your choice, you and this human will represent cooperation between two civilizations that evolved under very different histories. That responsibility will require patience, learning, and mutual trust. Seralith nodded once with calm confidence. I understand. The High Counselor paused before asking one final question. Then answer this clearly. Do you believe this human possesses the character necessary to stand beside you when challenges appear? The princess did not hesitate. She turned slightly toward Lucas Hale and studied him for a brief moment beneath the pale light of the chamber. Lucas met her gaze with the same quiet honesty he had shown throughout the entire ceremony. He did not attempt to impress her or offer another speech. He simply waited. Seralith returned her attention to the council elders. Yes, she said calmly. Because he does not pretend to be more than he is. The High Counselor listened carefully as she continued. He does not seek admiration. He does not speak to gain power. He listens, observes, and fixes problems when they appear. She gestured lightly toward the massive structure of Orion Gate surrounding them. Civilizations are not sustained by speeches. They are sustained by people who quietly keep the systems working. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence carried agreement rather than uncertainty. Several council elders exchanged long thoughtful glances before the High Counselor slowly rose from his seat. The movement immediately drew the attention of every observer in the hall. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the chamber. The council has heard the reasoning of Princess Seralith Vera and the words of human Lucas Hale. Tradition demands wisdom, and wisdom sometimes appears in unexpected forms. Lucas shifted his weight slightly as every pair of eyes in the arena turned toward him again. The High Counselor looked directly at the quiet maintenance worker and spoke with calm authority. Human Lucas Hale, you arrived here by accident. Yet today you have shown the council a rare quality. You do not chase recognition, but you accept responsibility when it appears. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck once more, clearly unsure how a routine workday had turned into a moment of interstellar importance. The High Counselor lifted his hand slowly and concluded in a steady voice. Therefore the council recognizes the choice of Princess Seralith Vera. The alliance ritual will proceed with the human she selected. For a heartbeat the enormous chamber remained completely silent. Then a soft wave of surprised murmurs spread through the balconies as the realization settled across the gathered observers that the quiet maintenance worker from Deck 7 had just become the chosen representative of humanity. For several seconds after the High Counselor finished speaking, the immense chamber of Orion Gate seemed to hold its breath. The murmurs across the balconies slowly softened until only the faint hum of the station's life support systems could be heard beneath the transparent dome of stars. Lucas Hale stood exactly where he had been standing moments earlier, the folded maintenance cloth still in his hand, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and quiet acceptance. He looked toward the High Counselor as if expecting someone to explain that a small administrative mistake had occurred. No one did. Instead the elder counselor stepped down from the elevated platform and walked slowly across the polished floor until he stood only a few feet away from the human technician. The distance between them was small, but the weight of the moment felt enormous. Human Lucas Hale, the counselor said gently, history often records great leaders, but it rarely records the quiet individuals who keep civilizations functioning every day. Lucas shifted slightly and answered with his usual calm honesty. Sir, most people on my station are just trying to do their jobs well enough that everything keeps running. The High Counselor nodded thoughtfully. And yet today that simple intention has guided the judgment of an entire council. Lucas glanced toward Princess Seralith beside him, still not entirely convinced that this outcome made sense. The princess met his gaze with the same composed warmth she had shown since the moment she chose him. For the first time since the ceremony began, Lucas noticed something different in her expression. It was not relief or triumph. It was trust. She stepped forward half a pace so that they both faced the enormous chamber together beneath the glowing dome. Hundreds of observers from distant star systems watched the unlikely pair standing side by side. Seralith spoke softly, but her voice carried across the hall. Every civilization seeks strength, she said. But strength without humility eventually fractures. She glanced briefly toward Lucas before continuing. Humans possess many contradictions, yet they also possess a rare instinct. They build systems where ordinary individuals protect the well-being of strangers they may never meet. Lucas gave a small embarrassed smile and quietly scratched the back of his neck again. Most humans would say that is just being decent, he said. The princess looked toward him with quiet certainty. Exactly. The High Counselor observed them both for a long moment before returning to the center platform. When he spoke again, his voice echoed calmly through the chamber. Let it be recorded that the alliance between the Sincerity people and the human colonies begins not with conquest, ambition, or political advantage, but with a choice based on character. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the stars above shimmered through the vast transparent ceiling. Lucas finally looked upward at the endless field of distant suns and then back toward the princess beside him. I still have a Lot to learn about all of this, he admitted quietly. Sarilith gave a small nod. So do I. They stood together beneath the quiet glow of the stars while the observers across the chamber watched in thoughtful silence. Somewhere deep within the station a ventilation unit on Deck 7 continued to circulate clean air through miles of corridors, just as it always had. And in that quiet moment, beneath the endless sky of distant worlds, the galaxy witnessed something unexpectedly simple. Not a hero.